Thank you. It's commonly believed that with the atrocities of September 11th, we're entering a new age of terror. It's the title of the first collection of academic essays that came out shortly after September 11th, mostly Yale University faculty. The editors of that collection regarded the anthrax scare, which at that time they attributed to Osama bin Laden, as even more dangerous and ominous than the events of September 11th. According to the consensus on the issue, nothing will be the same as the United States declares a new war on terror, reorienting the course of history. There was a similar consensus at the end of the Cold War. It was assumed that this is going to dramatically change the course of history. In both cases, the judgments seemed rather dubious. In retrospect, the initial skepticism about the end of the Cold War seems to have been verified. The end of the Cold War certainly had introduced changes. It modified pretexts and tactics, but the basic continuities of policy and global history are far more apparent, I believe, and in fact they were evident right away. Discussed this the other day, and I'll be brief, but the first Bush administration, immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, issued its National Security Strategy Report, called for a huge Pentagon budget, but now it was not because the Russians are coming. It was because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. That's why we needed the same budget we'd had in the past. We needed the same intervention forces, which, as before, were targeting the Middle East. There's a huge intervention system from Guam to the Azores that essentially targets Middle East oil resources. That's been there for a long time, and that had to stay. However, the reasons were different. The report explained that the serious threats to our interest in the oil-producing regions could not be laid at the Kremlin's door, as had been pretended for the preceding half-century. They also called for maintaining what's called the defense industrial base. It's a euphemism for high-tech industry. Pays my salary, for example. And it's also the core of the what's now called the new economy, for example, almost entirely derives from the dynamic state sector of the economy, much of it under a Pentagon cover, and that has to be retained. In fact, everything was pretty much as before, except for the pretexts. They were all different. It's kind of refreshing in a way. Back in 1990, the end of the Cold War did strip away many layers of illusion and deceit that could have been highly educational for the public, but they were carefully protected. All of this is very rarely discussed. It wasn't reported and is rarely discussed outside of dissident sectors, and those are scrupulously marginalized. That's actually a necessity in a free society, far more so than in dictatorships or totalitarian states, facts that have been understood for a long time. The fact that the policies reveal fundamental continuity shouldn't really be surprising. Policies are crucially rooted in domestic institutions. They embody a certain distribution of power. These are stable. They face very little change. Therefore, it's no great surprise if policy choices continue within a fairly narrow spectrum, with at most tactical and doctrinal modifications. I think there's good reason to expect the same to be true of September 11th, contrary to usual consensus. And I'm not alone in that. Several leading international relations scholars predicted right away that there will be basic continuity of policy after September 11th, that, quoting now, September 11th would at most further trends already in motion. Happens to be Kenneth Waltz, one of the most distinguished figures in international relations studies. He also, one of the trends that he predicted further that would continue, quoting him now, is proliferation of weapons of mass destruction by countries that know that the United States can be held at bay only by deterrence. That's a comment which has many implications. I'll come back to it. Seems to me plausible, a plausible judgment for essentially the same reasons I mentioned. It's reinforced in this case by the fact that the war on terror was not declared on September 11th, but was redeclared. It was redeclared by pretty much the same people who had declared it 20 years earlier with much the same rhetoric. They are now, many of them, back in power, redeclared the war, and they conducted it through the 1980s for 10 vicious and brutal years. They left a trail of corpses and devastation in Central America, the Middle East, Southern Africa, and elsewhere. It requires considerable historical amnesia to overlook the first phase of the war on terror when the recycled Reaganites redeclare it 20 years later, just as it takes impressive self-discipline not to notice that similar atrocities continued right through the 1990s. To investigate this, it actually suffices to look at the record of leading recipients of U.S. arms. That's a good way to see what policy is like. And in fact, it's a well-known fact, well documented in the scholarly literature, that there's a very high correlation between U.S. arms transfers and human rights violations. And it persisted through the 1980s and 1990s. So just take a look at the leading recipients. I'll put aside the perennials, Israel and Egypt. It's not an attractive story, but they belong to a different category. But apart from them, well, just take the year 1999, the championship was transferred, the prize was transferred from Turkey, which had been the leading recipient up till 1999. It was transferred to Colombia, which then became the leading recipient. Why? Well, Turkey had been carrying out a massive state terror campaign against its Kurdish population, which right through the 1990s, some of the worst atrocities of that grisly decade, but it relied crucially on U.S. arms. About 80% of the arms flow was from the Clinton administration. In the single year, 1997, the U.S. arms to Turkey, that single year, exceeded the combined total for the entire Cold War period up to the onset of the state terror campaign. Turkey was a strategically placed ally, so it was always getting plenty of arms, but it shot up when the state terror began, peaked in 1997, greater that single year than the entire Cold War period combined up to it. And it was quite ugly outcome. Hundreds of, several million people driven out of the devastated countryside, tens of thousands killed, every imaginable form of barbaric torture, relying crucially on the huge flow of American arms. 1997, as I said, was the peak year. It was an interesting year in other respects. So if you read the world's leading newspaper, the New York Times, 1997, that same year, was the year in which the Times commentators explained to us that U.S. foreign policy was entering into a noble phase with a saintly glow. None of this, what I've just described, was ever mentioned or barely mentioned. Turkey is now praised for its achievements in what's called successful counter-terror. Counter-terror is the name that is used for the terror that we carry out against somebody else. That's not a U.S. innovation. I think that's a historical universal. Even the most extraordinary mass murderers said the same thing. So that if you look back at the Nazi archives, they were not carrying out terror. They were defending the population from the terror of the partisans, who were terrorists supported from abroad, directed from London, all of which had an element of truth to it. Even the most vulgar propaganda usually has an element of truth to it. It's true that the partisans carried out terror. It's true that they were directed from London. And from within the Nazi system, the massive atrocities that they carried out within Europe, which we don't have to describe, were counter-terror and defense. And I think that's universal. I've never found an exception. Certainly the United States keeps to it rigorously. Our atrocities are counter-terror. Theirs are terror. What changed in 1999? Well, by 1999, the counter-terror, if you want to use the official term, was successful. The population was crushed. But Colombia, which through the 1990s had the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere, and by far was the largest recipient of U.S. Military aid and training, the usual correlation, they had not succeeded in crushing their own domestic populations. Therefore, they had to move up to first place. So Colombia replaced Turkey, and the atrocities there go on and on. Several million people internally displaced, maybe close to 1 million fled the country. Again, it has the level. The political killings are run at the level of maybe 10 or 20 a day. Even the State Department attributes about 80% of them to the military forces and the paramilitaries, which are so closely linked to the military forces that Human Rights Watch, which does some of the major studies on this, describes them as the 6th division of the Colombian Army. The first 5 are the official divisions, and there's the 6th division, which is the privatized version, the paramilitaries, to whom a lot of the terror is assigned. If you look over the years, the component of the roughly 80% of the terror that's attributed to the 2 of them, the component attributable to the military is declining, and it's being replaced by the paramilitaries. That's an aspect of what's sometimes called neoliberalism or privatization. You privatize terror by assigning it to paramilitaries. That's pretty standard. It's done by lots of people. Serbs did it, the Indonesians, lots of people. In fact, the United States is doing it in Colombia as well. Part of the atrocities is chemical warfare, which is being carried out under the pretext of a drug war to drive peasants off the land so that multinational corporations can go in and strip mine and take out the resources and destroy peasant agriculture and end up with monocrop agri-export. That's being privatized too. It's done by private corporations consisting of U.S. military officers, totally funded by the U.S. government, but private. So it's not the U.S. Army that's doing it. Actually, these 2 examples, apart from being objectively the peak cases, also happen to have a personal meaning for me. I've just in the last few months been in some of the worst parts of southeastern Turkey and southern Colombia, which are the scenes of some of these atrocities, and they're pretty horrendous. But you don't find out much about them if you keep to the conventional sources. Though if you look at such indices as arms transfers, you get a pretty good sense of where the atrocities around the world are being carried out. Actually, this is the United States, which happens to have very good information. I'd be pleasantly surprised if the British record were any different, or for that matter, the minor players like Canada, say. I haven't investigated it closely outside of my own country, the one where my primary responsibility is for the obvious reason, but you could try it for Canada, others could try it for other countries. Prediction probably going to come out pretty similar. Well, there is no doubt that September 11th did make a difference. We can see it. So take Iraq. Before September 11th, Iraq was not a major threat to anyone. A rotten place, but not a threat. After 9/11, it's an imminent threat to our existence. George Bush, the other day, when he was submitting the draft resolution to the United Nations, said that Iraq might attack us any day now with weapons of mass destruction. As he submitted the draft resolution, he also explained, as administration officials have been doing, that we interpret the resolution as authorizing us to act whenever we feel like it. And we have to, because tomorrow we might get that mushroom cloud that Condoleezza Rice is warning about. So something changed on September 11th. Iraq shifted from not a threat to an imminent threat to our existence. Actually, if you look a little more closely, the change was not on September 11th, it was this September. Up until this summer, Iraq was, again, a bad place, but wasn't threatening our existence. As the electoral campaign began for Congress, it suddenly became an imminent threat to our existence. And that worked. It drove all other issues off the agenda of the debate, and it was a spectacular electoral success. The threat to our existence has to be overcome this winter, not next winter, for similar reasons. By next winter, the presidential campaign will be underway, and this has got to be behind us by that time. The mushroom cloud that they're talking about is presumably going to land in New York. The neighboring countries don't seem to perceive the threat. Even Iran and Kuwait, both of which were attacked by the beast of Baghdad when he was a friend and ally of a favored friend of the United States and Britain. They are all trying to restore relations with Iraq. They despise Saddam Hussein, of course, but they don't consider him much of a threat, except to his own people, and that can't possibly be the reason for any concern in Washington and London, as the history makes brutally clear. People in the region and the governments in the region are afraid, but they're afraid of the United States. So some kind of radical change in the status of Iraq did take place, partly at 9/11, partly shortly after. But if we want to understand the world, we have to ask whether this is a change in objective threat, or for that matter, even a change in perceived threat, or whether it's a change in opportunity, a chance to escalate trends already in motion, as Kenneth Waltz put it, and to pursue long-standing goals, now with new pretexts. That's an important question, very serious question. It's one that ought to be a central focus of attention, at least for people who want to understand something about the world, not just march in parades, and people who feel some responsibility for their own actions or inaction. So let's proceed. I'll try to answer that question and others like it. A good place to try to understand the emerging framework of world order is just to look at the expectations of those with the power to shape the future, who will indeed do so unless they're constrained by an aroused public. So what do they expect? Well, take, say, President Bush. He's here I'll quote things he says about the war on terror, but let me repeat again that the term terror here is being used in a technical sense. It does not refer to terrorism as it's defined in the U.S. Code of Laws or the Army manuals, but rather to a subcategory of terror, the part that they carry out against us, not the part that we and our clients carry out against them, which is typically quite larger. That convention, though disgraceful, is unchallengeable, and I'll keep to it reluctantly, just noting a fundamental objection. So when I talk about terror, I'll keep to the convention. Talking about the war on terror, the President says, there is no telling how many wars it will take to secure freedom in the homeland, freedom from terror, that is. And that comment is quite fair. The threats are limitless, they're everywhere, They're even at home. The anthrax scare is a good example. It's been traced back to a federal lab. So if you want to bomb places that are potential terrorist threats, there are plenty of them. You don't have to send the Air Force very far. Furthermore, it's been known for a long time, well before September 11th, that serious terrorist threats, in this special sense of terror, are quite likely to take place. So 4 or 5 years ago, technical papers were circulating in the strategic analysis literature pointing out that the, quote one, that a well-planned operation to smuggle weapons of mass destruction, meaning nuclear weapons, into the United States would have about a 90% probability of success, far higher than a missile attack with or without missile defense. This presumably means smuggling across the porous Canadian border. Although one Harvard specialist, Graham Allison, before September 11th, just to indicate what it was like, suggested that the best way to get a nuclear weapon into New York, a New York hotel room, would be to wrap it in a bale of marijuana and send it through the New York harbor. Figured that'd have a high chance of success. About 4 years ago, so it's again a couple of years before 9/11, MIT Press published a book written by 3 major strategic analysts called America's Achilles Heel. And it was kind of like a guidebook for terrorists. Here's the many things you could do without too much sophistication that would cause massive destruction. The worst are nuclear weapons by a long shot, but others are not very pretty either. And all of this has surely been obvious since 1993. Remember that in 1993, groups closely associated with the ones who are presumably responsible for September 11th, and that come out of the same Afghan operations of the CIA and the British and so on, where they organized radical Islamists through the 1980s. Those groups connected to them, did come very close to blowing up the World Trade Center. And they had much more ambitious plans. This is 1993. They were going to blow up the FBI building, the UN buildings, tunnels under the river, and so on. The Trade Center engineers concluded that with a little better planning at the World Trade Center, they might have killed tens of thousands of people. Well, that was 1993. Since then, no one who even reads the papers, let alone technical papers, could have been very surprised and should be in the future surprised if there are large-scale, unanticipated terrorist attacks, which could be extremely destructive. The fact that one of these attacks was successful on September 11th in a particularly horrifying way, that doesn't actually change the assessment of risk very much. It stays about where it was. And it's a serious risk. Well, there are ways to increase the risk substantially. There are also ways to reduce the risk, and they're both reasonably well understood. So one way to increase the risk was described to Congress by the CIA about a month ago, namely attack Iraq. They pointed out to Congress that if the although they don't know of any Iraqi connection to terror now, and one is rather unlikely, incidentally, other global world intelligence agencies agreed in this judgment, France, Britain, and others. But the CIA pointed out to Congress that although there's no terrorist threat from Iraq now, if Iraq is attacked, there very likely will be a terrorist threat. For one thing, such an attack will very likely spawn a new generation of terrorists who are bent on revenge, maybe all over the world, and it could set off terrorist attacks that are already planned. Maybe there is a nuclear bomb already put together in a New York hotel room, nobody knows, but remember the 90% probability of success, and it could be there as a deterrent. Or for revenge, and it might go off or some other thing might happen if Iraq is attacked. There are also ways to reduce terror, even aside from the obvious way, namely stop participating in it, which would in fact cut it down quite a lot. But I'm not allowed to talk about that. That violates the convention, so I'll put that aside. Even keeping to the convention, there are ways to reduce terror, and they work. The one that works best is careful police work. That has succeeded since September 11th, rather significantly, primarily in Germany, which recently broke up a major al-Qaeda cell, and there are a few others, mostly in Europe. In contrast, bombing Afghanistan apparently had little effect and may have increased the threat, at least so U.S. intelligence believes, the FBI and the CIA. That's not a great surprise, actually. The role of Afghanistan in international terrorism was never very clear. How unclear it is was reported by the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, when he testified to Congress a couple of months ago in early June. He informed Congress that the FBI now believes, that's his word, the FBI now believes that the September 11th plot might have been hatched in Afghanistan, but that the implementation and the funding were in Germany and the United Arab Republics. That's 8 months after the bombing of Afghanistan. We've gotten as far as believing that maybe the plot was hatched there. That does raise the question, why bomb? The answer is not to get rid of the Taliban. That was not a war aim. That was thrown in at the end, practically at the end of the war. One suggestion was made by Abdul Haq, who was one of the most highly respected of the Afghan leaders struggling against the Taliban, highly respected by the United States and, in fact, by the new government. Like quite a few other anti-Taliban Afghan leaders, he was bitterly opposed to the bombing because he said it's undermining their efforts to overthrow the Taliban leadership, which of course they despised, to overthrow it from within, something which they thought was quite possible. But this is undermining the efforts. So what's his explanation for why the U.S. is bombing? Well, he said the U.S. is trying to show its muscle, score a victory, and scare everyone in the world. If that was the goal, they succeeded in that at least. Well, that's one analysis from an interesting source. But putting such analyses aside, there is a way to reduce terror, careful police work. That does have an effect. Another way to reduce terror, if you're serious about it, is to pay some attention to the people who have the most experience in the matter. So take, for example, the head of the Israeli secret police, Shabak, which basically runs the occupied territories, Ami Ayalon, who was head of the secret police up till 2000. He pointed out that those who want victory against terror want an unending war unless they're willing to address underlying grievances. The Bush planners understand that very well, but they don't want to address the underlying grievances. In contrast, an unending war would not be so bad, in fact, kind of essential for radical nationalists who have, I'm quoting again, who have adopted the classic modern strategy of an endangered right-wing oligarchy, which is to divert mass discontent into nationalism through fears of an external enemy that they conjure up. I'm quoting the same senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment. That's one of the reasons why the United States, why the world, much of the world, does regard the United States as a menace to itself and to mankind, quoting him again, if it continues on the present course. And there's nothing particularly novel about this. It's an old story. One of the famous American satirist, H.L. Mencken, back 70 years ago, pointed out that the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the public alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. And he's sort of right. There's plenty of experience about that, including, again, the worst mass murderers. So take, say, Hitler. If you go back to the 30s, he was warning that Czechoslovakia is a dagger pointed at the heart of Germany, and Germany's in serious danger. Furthermore, the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy is about to destroy the Aryan race, the inheritors of Greek civilization, the peak of Western civilization. So Germany is really in danger, and it worked. And similar things have worked many times. The tactic, as I mentioned, worked beautifully for the recent elections. You can read about it by leading political scientists right now, op-eds in the New York Times and so on, pointing out how nicely it worked. And it'll be needed for the coming presidential campaign. So put yourself in the shoes of George Bush's campaign manager, Karl Rove, and imagine what he's going to want people to be thinking about when the presidential campaign starts in early following year, 2004. The last thing he wants people to be thinking about is what happened to their jobs or their pensions or their limited health care or Social Security or about the Enron crisis and what George Bush has to do with Ken Lay, or destruction of the environment for their children, or the accelerated and quite extraordinary concentration of wealth that's being fostered by the radical nationalist leadership, who are dedicated with extremism that goes well beyond the norm to a very narrow sector of the corporate power, a particularly corrupt sector. Rather, what they're supposed to be doing next year is singing praises to the heroic leader who saved them from imminent destruction by a power of awesome proportions, and will by then be marching on to some new adventure, while the population is clamoring for safety, as Mencken put it. All of this, remember, is second nature to the recycled Reaganites who are now the central planners. 20 years ago, they were doing the same thing. 20 years ago, another brave cowboy was in the White House, and he was huddled there surrounded by tanks while Libyan hitmen were wandering the streets of Washington trying to assassinate him, and the population in the United States was properly frightened by this awesome danger. A few years later, he was wailing about how Gaddafi wants to expel America from the world, no less. And he was warning that the Nicaraguan army is only 2 days marching time from Texas. Nicaragua is a dagger pointed at the heart of Texas, to borrow some rhetoric. And what they're doing is carrying out a plan to conquer the hemisphere. They're following a script from Mein Kampf. I'm quoting from the congressional testimony of George Shultz, Secretary of State. He was the administration moderate, the Colin Powell of the day. And at that time, repeatedly, year after year, Americans were frightened and terrified by something or other. And it did enable the administration to ram through a domestic program which concentrated wealth very narrowly, stagnation or decline for most of the population, undercut social spending and so on, but people were frightened enough to accept it. So it's kind of second nature to do it at the time. Well, back to Ami Ayalon, the head of Shabak, and how to reduce terror, namely by addressing underlying grievances. He was, of course, speaking of Israel-Palestine, where, quoting again, the only solution of the problem of terrorism is to offer an honorable solution to the Palestinians, respecting the right of self-determination. Actually, now I'm quoting somebody else, a predecessor of his, Yehoshaphat Harkabi, who was the head of military intelligence and a well-known Israeli Arabist, and this is from 20 years ago. That's after another shocking outburst of settler and army violence in the territories, and that was at a time when Israel still remained complete immunity from retaliation from within the territories to the harsh and brutal practices it was carrying out, including taking the land and the resources. This was all thanks to U.S. support. Otherwise, they can't do a thing. They can go as far as the U.S. supports them and permits, not any further. Well, the immunity lasted until very recently, a couple of years ago, and therefore the violence and repression were considered quite unproblematic by American elite opinion. That takes us back to the definition of terror. Then it was something that we're doing to them, so it's okay. But once the immunity is lost, then there's something that they're doing to us, maybe a fraction of what we've been doing to them, and that's horrendous. Again, usual situation. Unless one addresses grievances and finds the legitimate ones and deals with them, it is true that you will enhance terror. The way to reduce terror is to pay some attention to the grievances and try to address them. It's not going to get rid of everything, but it's an effective way to reduce terror, as anyone who's seriously concerned about doing this, like the high intelligence and military echelon in Israel, understands very well. And it was true in Northern Ireland, it was true in South Africa, and it's quite general. Unfortunately, it was not recognized in Northern Ireland and South Africa until after a great deal of violence and suffering. But when the grievances began to be addressed, there was some step forward. And that generalizes in pretty obvious ways. So in serious scholarship, it's recognized, quoting again, that unless the social, political, and economic conditions that spawned al-Qaeda and other associated groups are addressed, the United States and its allies will continue to be targeted by terrorists. Happens to be a University of Texas specialist on the topic, but it's very common in the scholarly literature. It's only intellectuals who are posturing before the galleries who sink to such mindless absurdities as charging that explanation is justification, or to claims about how it's all their fault. We play no role by definition, since we're so obviously good, maybe even magnificent. That's the common stance of the powerful through the ages. We're not breaking any new ground, just replaying an old record. In fact, the commitment to this is so strong that even the crucial internal U.S. government record, which has been known for years at the highest levels, even that has to be rigorously suppressed. So take the question that George Bush asked, why do they hate us? Answer, because we're so good, remember that. Well, he was not the first president to ask that question. That question, for example, was asked by President Eisenhower in 1958, in secret, but it's been public for 10 years. In his internal staff discussions in 1958, Eisenhower brought before his staff the observation that, in his words, there's a campaign of hatred against us among the people of the Arab world, and there was discussion, and the National Security Council, the highest planning body, came out with an analysis. The analysis is that there is a recognition in the Arab world that the United States supports brutal and oppressive regimes and blocks democracy and development, and we do this because of our interest in controlling the oil resources of the region, and that leads to a campaign of hatred. That was the analysis then, and it remains the analysis today. We don't have declassified documents from last year, but we do have attempts to investigate opinion in the Arab world. So immediately after September 11th, some of the better newspapers, first the Wall Street Journal and then a couple of others, did the obvious thing. They went to try to assess the opinions in the Arab countries. The Wall Street Journal investigated the kind of people they were interested in, what they called moneyed Muslims. So bankers and heads of, directors of multinational corporations and professionals and so on, to find out what their attitudes were, and it's the same as 1958. They're bitterly opposed to U.S. policy. They're not opposed to globalization, so-called. They're right in the middle of it. None of these things. They're opposed to the fact that the United States continues to support harsh and brutal regimes and to block democracy and development because of its interest in controlling Near East oil. Now there's other particular policies that have exacerbated this, like with regard to the Palestinians and Iraq, which didn't exist back in '58. But the basic feelings are about the same. There's nothing to do with hating America. These are people who like Americans, they admire them, they like a lot about the United States, they admire American freedom and democracy. What they hate is U.S. government policies that continue to block it, that block democracy and development and support brutal and repressive regimes in order to ensure control over these oil resources, which are not slight. Back in 1945, the State Department described the oil resources of the Gulf region as a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. Not a small thing. And therefore the U.S. had to take control over it. Now here you have to be a little cautious. The issue is control, not access. There's a lot of misleading discussion about this in the press. It has nothing to do with access. Control. Control of the material prize ensures that there's a huge flow of wealth that goes back to the people who have a right to it in the United States and Britain, energy corporations, U.S. Treasury, high-tech industry that sends arms and so on. You can guarantee that the flow goes back that way, not somewhere else. And strategic power means a lever of world control. That's critical for understanding U.S. goals right now in Iraq. Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world. The U.S. is deeply committed to gaining control of them. Control, not access. Access has not been a problem in the past, and it's not expected to be in the future. Well, let's at this point go to the expectations of the powerful again, which bear directly on this. And luckily for us, they tell us loud and clear and in some detail. So you want to learn about the expectations, they're right there on paper. So for example, the National Intelligence Council in the United States, that's a combination of the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, other major intelligence agencies, recently, about 3 years ago, put out a document, important document, called Global Trends 2015. That's projections it was in the year 2000, projections for the next 15 years. This was done with the participation of academic specialists and people in the business community. Here's their main prediction. The prediction is that what they call globalization will continue on course. Its evolution will be rocky, with increasing financial volatility and a widening economic divide. Okay, keep that in mind. That's the main prediction. Those of you who've taken economics courses or read this stuff know that in this technical sense in which globalization is supposed to lead to convergence, it's supposed to lead to an integrated market with a single wage and price. So what they're predicting is less globalization in the technical sense, widening divide, but more globalization in the doctrinally preferred sense. That is, the people who matter will do fine, and the rest, somebody else's department. What does financial volatility mean? Financial volatility, more volatility means slower growth, harming mainly the poor. So their main prediction is that globalization will decrease in the technical sense, widening economic divide, though the rich will make out fine, and growth and development will be slower. Well, that prediction lifts the veil on a very striking feature of foreign policy in the past 25 years. I mean, known to professionals or activists, but not too well known by the public. And that is that the so-called globalization policies, the neoliberal policies, sometimes called the Washington Consensus, they've been accompanied by a marked deterioration in standard macroeconomic measures over the past 25 years. That includes growth of the economy, growth of productivity, growth of investment, even growth of trade has slowed in the past 25 years. There's been stagnation for most of the population, a much higher workload, lower benefits, a highly concentrated wealth. That's true of the richest country in the world, dramatically, but it's rather general throughout the world, apart from countries that just didn't follow the rules. The generalization is quite strong. In fact, rather striking is the fact that the regions of the world that followed the rules most rigorously, like Latin America, are the ones that suffered the most. And the ones that largely ignored the rules, like East Asia, they did pretty well. They escaped the general decline, and in fact, sometimes did extremely well. That's one aspect of so-called globalization, which has nothing to do with globalization. It has to do with a very specific form of international economic integration. Even more striking is the way in which the neoliberal policies, including financial liberalization, undermine democracy. In fact, that's sort of their main purpose and effect. And that's well known, too. It was known back in 1945 when the post-war economic system was established based on regulation of capital. States are allowed to control capital flow, and currencies are more or less fixed. And the system was set that way to give governments a certain space to carry out social democratic welfare state measures. And this is well understood. Actually, there's a good book on this by University of Toronto political economist Eric Helleiner, but it's pretty well known and it's pretty obvious. The facts are also very well understood among the victims, notably in Latin America, where the story is being played out right in front of our eyes. In Brazil, financial volatility is the device being used to ensure that the democratic choice of the Brazilian electorate will not be allowed to function. That's a major consequence of liberalization of finance 25 years ago and of the other neoliberal measures like privatization and so on. Well, the conclusion of the powerful is that we must extend and intensify the global policies that have these consequences. That's essentially what I was reading from the projections. That's been, for the last 20 years, that's given rise to major popular struggles throughout the world. Some of the most important developments on the world scene. I have to put that aside for lack of time. Well, let's go back to the expectations. What's going to be the effect of a widening economic divide? Well, here's the National Intelligence Council again. As this increases, as globalization in their sense proceeds, deepening economic stagnation will foster political, ethnic, ideological, and religious extremism, along with violence, much of it directed against the United States. Okay, that's the intelligence projection. So we're back to terrorism and underlying grievances that have to be addressed, unless we prefer more terrorism, of course. If we want to prefer terrorism and unending wars, then yes, ignore the underlying grievances, which we're expecting to intensify by the international economic policies that we are insisting upon. And as I mentioned, that's a pretty rational choice for kind of a radical nationalist extremist leadership, such as those who hold the reins of power today. Interesting and important fact is that the same assumptions are made by military planners. So to indicate how narrow the spectrum is, you can go back to some Clinton-era documents, one that I mentioned a couple of days ago, so I won't go on with it. But one of the most important is vision for 2020, the next 20 years, 25 years, because it was written 5 years earlier. Clinton's Space Command, which predicts a growing gap between haves and have-nots. The have-nots will be disruptive. They have to be controlled. The same prediction as the National Intelligence Council about the consequences of deepening stagnation and a widening economic divide. And that's part of the thinking behind the vast expansion of U.S. military power. It's going to be needed to control the disruptive masses as the stagnation and widening economic divide drive them to things like terrorism. You know, I'm sure, that the United States comes close to outspending essentially the rest of the world combined in military expenditure, and that's misleading because it doesn't include U.S. client states. So take, say, Israel. Israel's a small country, but it's an outpost of the U.S. military in many respects, so it has a huge military system. In fact, according to the senior analysts of the Israeli IDF, the Israeli Armed Forces, Israeli air and naval forces are larger and technologically more advanced than any NATO power, outside the U.S., of course. That's only one. You know, Britain is another major, mainly warrior state. That's its comparative advantage, military force. 9/11, September 11th, so that's all part of the U.S. military establishment. September 11th was a pretext for a sharp increase in military spending. It's completely unrelated to terrorism. Takes a ballistic missile defense, and remember that figure of 90% probability of getting a nuclear weapon in the United States with a well-planned effort, much higher than any missile. It's nothing to do with defense. It has a lot to do with global control. A lot to say about this. I talked a little about it the other day, so I won't go on with it now. Well, let's turn to the Middle East, which is the focus of a great deal of current concern, rightly. The National Intelligence Council projection for the next 15 years predicts that there will be a rising demand for energy and that therefore the Kyoto protocols will be demolished. It doesn't matter if anybody signs them or not, so Canada can stop debating the matter. That will lead to, they predict, to increased global warming. One of the major arguments for a war in Iraq is that when the U.S. regains control over Iraqi oil, it'll be able to lower the price to help increase the rising demand and the destruction of the environment, another threat to survival, but again, rational within a kind of lunatic framework. The National Intelligence Council goes on to say that the Persian Gulf region will see large increases in oil production capacity and will rise in importance to the world energy markets, and therefore the U.S. must control them, as it has since the Second World War. That's the stupendous source of strategic power and so on. They go on to predict that the U.S. itself is not going to rely on Middle East oil. Rather, it's going to rely on more stable sources in the Atlantic Basin, like Brazil and the rest of Latin America and West Africa and Canada. Nothing new about this. After World War II, the United States was the major oil, North America was the major oil producer till about 1970. The U.S. didn't use a drop of Middle East oil. Since that time, the main importer into the United States has usually been Venezuela. But this had nothing to do with the need to control Persian Gulf oil, or by now such secondary sources as Central Asian oil and others. The goal is control, not access. That has always been understood and is completely explicit and is completely understandable. So again, in 1958, when there was some disruption in the system, President Eisenhower reiterated his view that the Persian Gulf oil-producing region is the most strategically important area in the world, and to lose control of this strategic position and the resources of the Middle East would be worse than the loss of China. Notice that he's talking about control, not access, because the U.S. didn't use any of that oil and had no expectation of doing it, but control is what mattered then, and it's what matters now. Well, the coming war in Iraq, this is one of the underlying factors, almost undoubtedly. There are pretexts that are offered. You've heard them all. It's pretty hard to take them seriously, I think. I can return in discussion if you like. But there are reasons, good reasons. One of them is the long-standing commitment to regain control over the stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. September 11th offered a pretext for that, incidentally offered a similar window of opportunity for lots of other countries. So Russia, for example, increased its atrocities in Chechnya, under the pretext of a war on terror, expecting correctly to get authorization from Washington. China did the same thing in Western China. Indonesia did the same thing in Aceh. Israel did the same thing in the occupied territories, and you can run down the list. For the United States, too, it offered a pretext to pursue more actively policies that were already there. Domestic political considerations dictate the timing. It has to be this winter. Next winter's too late, not because of the mushroom cloud, but for more mundane reasons like the presidential election. There is a security issue, serious one. It's necessary to secure the domestic economic program of service to a very narrow sector of unusually corrupt corporate power, along with a continuing assault against the general population, and also the global dominance based on absolute military superiority. That program has to be secured for another 4 years, and that's a security problem, but it's the only major security problem. The plans now underway are expected to increase the threat to the United States, but it's just a secondary matter. Well, by next year, the next phase of the program might well be underway. Israel's air and naval forces, and remember their scale, over 10% of them are permanently based now in eastern Turkey, in the huge U.S. military bases there. Also, Israeli armored forces are there, presumably in case the Kurds, this is a Kurdish region, in case the Kurds get out of control again and got to repress them. But the air and naval forces are permanently there, and the air forces, according to the best sources we have, are flying at the Iranian border, looking forward to the next step in the continuing process of ensuring global dominance through absolute military superiority. Israel doesn't take Iraq very seriously, but they do regard Iran as a country that they can't control by themselves, and they want the U.S. to do it for them. It's possible that that war is sort of underway in its early stages. And there are much broader plans, according to U.S. scholarly sources and according to the Israeli press, which is generally quite reliable and is particularly illuminating right now because of the very close links that hold between the Bush planners and the far right in Israel. I'm not talking about Ariel Sharon. I'm talking about the right wing to the right of Sharon. So people like Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith, close to the planning sectors, back in the mid-90s, they were writing position papers for Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's off to the right of Sharon, way at the extreme end. And the plans are pretty amazing when you read about them. They've been harshly criticized by the most influential U.S. strategic analysts who are warning the government not to be caught up in what they call, some quoting one calls, the neocon fantasies of sillier armchair strategists and more vocally irresponsible hardliners. Quoting Anthony Cordesman, he's referring to Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith and others who are quite close to the center of power. He himself, Cordesman, is about as hardline as one can find within the saner planning spectrum, and he's the leading military strategic analyst on the in the U.S. government, close to the government, who works on these areas, which is another indication of why the world is deeply concerned about U.S. power and its exercise now. Well, a lot more to say about this. There's also some good news, and I'll end with that. The good news, which we all know, is that folks like us are highly privileged. We're not like people in Turkey and Colombia. We talk about these things. We're not going to be sent to Turkish prisons or be assassinated by paramilitary terrorists. We can act without fear of prison, torture, assassination, and so on, things that are faced constantly with remarkable courage and dedication. Actually inspires humility to see it, or should, among people who are as privileged as we are. We don't face any of those problems. We have the means to determine whether these tendencies, and they are ominous, whether they continue, or whether policy takes a far different course, a more constructive course, and the enormous wealth and power that we have in our hands will be used to build rather than to destroy. And in the Russell lecture, it should be unnecessary even to bring any of this up. There could hardly be a more inspiring model for what can and must be done than the great 20th century figure to whose memory these lectures are dedicated.